Today we're looking at the Summit by Novation. This is a 5-octave, 16-voice analog synthesizer, and it's basically two of Novation's peak desktop modules, which are 8-voice, combined plus a velocity and aftertouch sensitive keyboard. Now, is Summit fully analog? It's not. The oscillators are digitally controlled, and they're called Oxford oscillators. They're descended from the OSC Oscar and the EDP Wasp, with the involvement of the designer Chris Huggett, who's been a consultant to Novation for a long time. So the aim with these oscillators is to sound entirely analog while being digitally stabilized and keeping the cost of the Summit reasonable. The Summit offers single and multi-patches, and in multi-mode you have layer, split or dual options. So let's look first just at some single sounds. The first one that comes up, Dystopian, sounds a lot like Vangelis playing the Yamaha CS80 on the Blade Runner soundtrack. And that can be added to a lot if you switch glide on. The glide is polyphonic. And as you can see on this patch, the aftertouch is working as well. You can open and close the filter. So that can be highly expressive. I must say the aftertouch isn't implemented on a lot of the factory sounds, so you do well to look into adding that yourself. Aftertouch is one of the few parameters which are confined to the 4-line LCD display. Almost everything else has its own knob, so the Summit is quick and easy to program. You'll notice that the envelopes are on sliders instead of pots, and the layout is quite simple to follow, quite conventional. The 3 oscillators first, then the cross modulation of the oscillators, a mixer including white noise and ring modulation, and there's 2 envelopes on sliders, the 2 specific LFOs and the 2 global LFOs. Filters are to the left of the envelopes. There's 2 filters, a switchable 12 and 24 decibel low pass and a multi-mode low pass, band pass, high pass dual filter. That setup is also on the Moog 1, and it is versatile. It means that your analog sounds don't have to be dominated by a booming heavy bass. You can get much lighter, more delicate sounds. Finally, the effects units, distortion, and by the way there's also an overdrive going into the filter as well as distortion going out. And then chorus, which features an ensemble setting like the old Selena string synths. Delay, which has a sync function to sync to the LFOs and Arpeggiator. And then reverb with 3 sizes of simulated space. And there's a bypass button for the effects, which is handy, particularly if you're in the studio and more interested in having clean sounds to which you can add effects in the mix. So that's a programming layout. In terms of controllers, you've got the usual pitch bend and modulation, octave up and down. You've got 2 buttons called animates. Now I would call these momentary switches. They add in a different type of modulation, perhaps a more widely open filter or a different octave setting, and you just push and hold that to get the effect you want. Hit hold if you want it to stay, or hit the button again if you want it to go back to normal. When you're editing multi-parts, well, in fact there are only 2 parts, you can decide whether you edit A or B or both. And finally, there's this lovely LED display for the number of active voices. It's useful to see how many voices are playing in any particular patch, because you might get voice stealing if you go over 16. Some of the Summit patches are in unison mode as well, so using up a lot of voices. But generally, with 16 voices, you don't get short, even when playing big polyphonic chords. The Summit's LCD display is simple compared to some others because there's so much available on knobs and sliders. So you do have some additional parameters for oscillator, envelope, LFO, arpeggiator, modulation, filters, effects and effects modulation. Only half a dozen pages for each of those, so the menu is easy to navigate and it's quite simple to find anything you might want. For example, as I mentioned earlier, the aftertouch parameter is on here, and you might want to get at that to wind up some of the aftertouch on some of the patches. Also on the LCD, and in fact this is the default display, you get the sound name and the bank and category which it's in. Going through the categories here: arpeggiator, bass, bell, classic, drum, percussion, keyboard, lead, motion, pad, and a few more. Obviously it's handy to stay in one category if you know what sort of sound you're looking for. So here on pads, you'll only get the suitable pads: deep plane, atmosphere, Atlantis, alpine lake, and so on. Just looking at the bank display, there's 3 banks of 128 sounds for factory patches, and bank D contains the bank A sounds, again reprogrammable by the user. Let's look at some of these factory patches. First, in the bass category, you'd expect any analog synth to be able to do nice fat bass sounds. On that sound II Guy, you can hear something like formant filtering going on. That's a combination of the 2 types of filter and the fact that on the oscillators, not only do you have 4 stable analog waves, but you've got a whole set of digital wavetables which come up when you select the button More, and the wavetables include vowel sounds, metallic digital sounds, and others which will allow the Summit to play sounds a bit more like wavetable and digital synthesizers like the PPG and Waldorf designs. Again, there doesn't seem to be a huge use of these digital sounds in the factory presets. You should have a look yourself and see what those digital wavetable sounds can do. Let's have a look at a few lead sounds. After all, any analog synth should be able to do good leads. So good choice of lead sounds. Let's look at some motion patches. Just watch the voice count going up on this one. So as I mentioned before, in patches which use unison modes or dual modes, you can use your voices up quite quickly. Let's look though at some other motion and pad sounds, some which have the arpeggiator working. Interesting things going on there with the multi-mode filters and maybe some of the digital waveforms playing there. Let's have a look at some of the arpeggiator sounds. Novation has always been good at arpeggiators, and a lot of the factory sounds here will make you sound instantly like Jean-Michel Jarre, who's a big Novation user, or indeed like Tangerine Dream on this sound, Orange Nightmare. The Summit's arpeggiator is particularly powerful because it's so easy to change its settings with an octave switch and a direction of play switch, and the ability to easily latch it on so it plays when you take your fingers off the keys. Let's have a quick look at some of the multi-patches, 4 banks of 128 multis, and look at this one, Hardcore Score. All 16 voices playing under one key there. Obviously a lot more atmospheric stuff in the multi-patches as well. I'm going to put additional effects on this one. Here's an example of the digital waveforms playing in a layer mode sound. Now when you come to make your own sounds, the Summit is quite easy to use. Here's the oscillator with 4 footage settings and its 4 basic wave shapes plus the more function which gives you the digital wave shapes. An oscillator can have its pitch modified by envelope 2 or the LFO, and that applies to all 3 oscillators, so obviously a lot of modulation can go on. And then you have FM, which is cross-patching one oscillator to another. Oscillator 3 can go to 1, 1 can go to 2, and 2 can go to 3. And those can be sourced from the modulation envelope, LFO2, or manual adjustment. So there's a lot going on there in the area of FM synthesis. The mixer is easy enough. In addition to the oscillators, it has a ring modulator level between oscillator 1 and 2 and white noise. And then we saw earlier the filters, which are easy to adjust, and the envelopes and effect settings. So nothing hidden on the Summit. It's quite easy to make up and store your own sounds. Just a couple of possible negatives on the panel. When you go to use the data wheel, your left hand is going to obscure the display that you want to adjust. You could instead use the value up-down buttons, but these actually do only go one up and one down. If you hold them, they don't scan through patches. The patch buttons here are exactly the same. They'll go one patch up and one patch down, but if you hold them, they don't scan through all the patches. So the better placement of this data knob would have been down here in this blank space, and when you adjust it, you don't obscure the display. Along the top of the panel here, it would have been nice to have labelled the back panel sockets. There's a good choice there for audio outs, 2 audio ins, MIDI in out through USB and 2 pedal sockets, and thankfully a mains power cable and not an external power supply. As I mentioned, there's audio inputs which go to the effects units. So you could use the Summit to add effects to any other instrument like guitar or other sound sources, and the distortion, chorus, delay and reverb will all be available to do that. On earlier Novation models there's been a useful vocoder patch. That isn't here, which is a shame. Let's just finish with a few more polysynth sounds. These are all single sounds, though you'd be forgiven for thinking that there are more than one layer playing. So that's the Novation Summit. Well designed and laid out, powerful sounds, a wonderful velocity and aftertouch sensitive keyboard, arpeggiator and effects, analog waveforms, but also a lot of digital waveforms and cross modulation, giving you a lot more sonic possibilities. So if you're particularly into techno and ambient music and anything else which you want a wide choice of analog sounds, the Summit is definitely worth looking at.